Alexander Mercer had built his fortune the way most self-made billionaires did, through relentless sacrifice, sleepless nights, and a bone-deep refusal to quit when the world told him he should. At 33 years old, he sat atop Mercer Industries, a conglomerate that touched everything from clean energy technology to real estate development across 14 states. Forbes had listed him 3 years running. His penthouse in Manhattan looked out over Central Park like a king surveying his kingdom. And yet, on the morning of what should have been the happiest day of his life, Alexander Mercer sat alone in a marble bathroom, staring at his own reflection with something very close to dread. The wedding was scheduled for 4 o'clock. The Grand Whitmore Hotel had been booked in its entirety, all 212 rooms, for guests who had flown in from London, Dubai, Tokyo, and beyond. White roses and imported gardenias had transformed the ballroom into something that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. His wedding planner had described it as the event of the decade, and she had not been exaggerating. His fiancée, Victoria Langston, was 29 years old and objectively stunning. She had grown up in old money, the daughter of a Connecticut senator, educated at Yale, polished in a way that came from a lifetime of knowing exactly which fork to use at dinner. She was articulate, beautiful, socially magnetic, and had made it very clear from the beginning of their 18-month relationship that she admired Alexander's success. Perhaps a little too clearly if he was being honest with himself. It had started as a whisper in the back of his mind, small moments that didn't quite add up. The way Victoria's eyes drifted to his watch when they first met at a charity gala. The casual mentions of his properties in conversations with her friends, loud enough for him to overhear. The prenuptial agreement negotiation, where her attorney had fought harder for a larger settlement clause than anyone had expected. Alexander had pushed the whispers down, told himself he was being paranoid, told himself that a woman like Victoria could have chosen anyone, and she had chosen him. But 3 nights ago, he had overheard a phone call. He hadn't meant to listen. He had come back to the penthouse early from a business dinner, moving quietly through the hallway because he'd had a headache, and Victoria's voice had carried from the sitting room with a clarity that the universe seemed to have arranged specifically for him to hear. "Of course I love the lifestyle, Bren. Who wouldn't? The man is worth $6 billion. I'm not throwing that away." A pause. "Do I love him? I love what he provides. There's a difference. But he doesn't need to know that." Alexander had stood in that hallway for a long time afterward. He hadn't confronted her. He hadn't called off the wedding. Instead, something cold and methodical had taken over. The same instinct that had helped him survive a hostile takeover at 27, and he had started to think. He needed to know the truth. Not the truth he feared, but the complete truth, tested under conditions that stripped away every advantage his name and wealth provided. He needed to see who Victoria Langston truly was when she believed no one important was watching. And so the plan had formed. On the morning of his wedding day, Alexander Mercer slipped out of the hotel through a service exit before dawn. He had arranged everything with a kind of careful precision that had made him a billionaire. Worn clothing borrowed from his head of security. A gray hoodie, frayed at the cuffs. Scuffed boots. A wool cap pulled low. 3 days of stubble he had been cultivating specifically for this purpose. No phone. No watch. A single $20 bill in his pocket. He would spend the morning outside his own wedding venue, sitting on the steps of the hotel's side entrance like a man who had nowhere else to be, and he would watch. He would watch how the people in his life treated someone they perceived as invisible, as worthless, as beneath them. What he witnessed in the first 2 hours confirmed his worst fears about Victoria. She had arrived at 9 in the morning for bridal preparations, sweeping past him in the doorway of the service entrance with her entourage trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Alexander had been seated on the cold stone steps, head down, a paper coffee cup in his hands that a kind passerby had actually filled for him, because he looked that convincing, which had struck him as both useful and quietly devastating. Victoria had not looked at him. That much he had expected. But then her heel had caught the edge of his boot, barely a graze, and she had turned with a sharp exhale that cut through the morning air. "Watch where you put yourself," she had said, her voice carrying the particular sting of someone who had never once questioned their right to take up space. "These are Louboutins." Her maid of honor had laughed. Alexander had said nothing, had looked up just briefly enough to see the irritation in Victoria's eyes, not at having nearly tripped, but at the existence of the person who had caused it. There was no curiosity there, no human recognition, just a flicker of contempt, and then she was gone through the door, already talking about champagne and seating charts. He sat with that for a long while. But then the real surprise of the morning had come, not from the woman he was about to marry, but from the woman who cleaned the rooms above his head. He had noticed her first because of the child. A little girl, maybe 3 years old, with dark curls that escaped from 2 uneven pigtails and a serious expression that seemed almost comically too large for such a tiny face. She was toddling along the side pathway that ran beside the service entrance, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen far better days. Behind her, moving with the careful exhaustion of someone who had been awake since before the sun rose, came a young woman in the pale gray uniform of the hotel's housekeeping staff. She couldn't have been older than 28. She was slight, with warm brown eyes that carried the particular quality of someone who had learned to find beauty in small things because large things had not always been kind to her. There was a gentleness in how she watched the little girl, vigilant and tender at the same time, the way only mothers are. He would learn her name soon enough. For now, he just watched as the little girl stopped walking. The toddler had spotted him on the steps, this rumpled, unshaven stranger with a paper cup and nowhere to be on a Saturday morning, and instead of turning away, instead of grabbing her mother's hand and hiding behind her leg the way most children would have, she had done something that Alexander Mercer, for all his wealth and all his experience with the world, was completely unprepared for. She had walked toward him. Small, deliberate steps on the stone pathway, her stuffed rabbit dragging behind her, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an expression of complete and uncomplicated concern, as though she had assessed the situation in the way that only very young children can, without pretense or agenda, and had arrived at a simple conclusion. This person is sad. I should do something about that. Her name was Rosa Delgado, and she had learned a long time ago that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who looked through the invisible ones, and those who looked at them. She had been invisible for most of her adult life. Not in the way that beautiful women sometimes claimed invisibility as a kind of false modesty, but in the genuine, structural way that came from wearing a uniform and carrying a mop bucket through the corridors of places that were built for other people's celebrations. She had cleaned the suites of senators and CEOs, had remade beds in rooms where last night's champagne still lingered in the air, had folded towels in bathrooms that cost more per night than she made in a month. She did it without bitterness, which was something she was quietly proud of. Bitterness was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially now. Especially since Lily, her daughter, Lily Rosa Delgado, 3 years old last November, named for Rosa's grandmother who had crossed the border with nothing but a photograph and a fierce, unconquerable love for the family she was building, was the organizing principle of Rosa's entire existence. Everything Rosa did, every early morning and late night, every skipped lunch and walked mile instead of bus fare, was arithmetic done in Lily's name. A better preschool, a safer neighborhood, eventually. A life where Lily would not have to learn invisibility as a survival skill. This particular Saturday morning had begun at 5:45, when Rosa had bundled Lily into her coat while it was still dark outside because the hotel's daycare for staffed children didn't open until 7, and Rosa's shift began at 6, and her neighbor, Mrs. Kaminsky, who usually watched Lily in the Gap, had called the night before to say her own grandson was sick. So Lily had come to work with her mother, as she sometimes did on difficult mornings, tucked into the supply room with her rabbit and her crayons and the iPad loaded with 2 downloaded episodes of her favorite cartoon, while Rosa moved through the early morning tasks of a hotel preparing for the biggest event it had hosted in 5 years. Alexander Mercer's wedding had been the talk of the housekeeping department for 3 weeks. The flowers alone, their supervisor had told them during the Tuesday briefing, cost more than the annual salary of every housekeeper on their floor combined. Rosa had not said anything to that. She had written down her assignment list and gotten to work. By 9 o'clock, she had finished the third-floor rooms and come back down to collect Lily, who was supposed to stay quietly in the supply room but had, in the way of all 3-year-olds presented with a closed door and no supervision, decided that the outdoors looked more interesting. Rosa had turned the corner to find the supply room empty and experienced the particular maternal terror that is entirely disproportionate to the actual elapsed time. Lily had been unsupervised for perhaps 4 minutes, but which feels, in the body, like falling from a great height. She had moved quickly down the service corridor and pushed through the side door into the gray morning light, and there was Lily, already halfway across the stone pathway, already moving with absolute intention toward the man sitting on the steps. "Lily," Rosa said softly, not wanting to startle either of them. But Lily didn't stop. The man on the steps had looked up at Lily's approach, and Rosa had caught his expression in the instant before he rearranged it. Something raw and unguarded there, something that looked, to her practiced eye, like a person who had been carrying a very heavy thing alone for a very long time. She had seen that expression before. She owned it herself some mornings, in the bathroom mirror before she put the day on. Lily stopped directly in front of the man. She looked up at him with those serious dark eyes, the stuffed rabbit hanging from one hand. And then, with the gravity and ceremony of someone performing a ritual of great importance, she held out the rabbit. Offering it to him, Rosa's throat tightened. She understood what this meant, because she knew Lily. That rabbit. His name was Mr. Flops, a name Lily had selected herself with great deliberation, was Lily's most precious possession. He had been with her since she was 14 months old. She slept with him every night. She had cried for 45 minutes once when he had accidentally been left at the laundromat, and Rosa had driven back across town at 9:30 at night to retrieve him. Mr. Flops was not offered lightly. Mr. Flops was not offered at all under normal circumstances. And yet here was Lily, holding him out to a stranger on the steps, because she had decided, with the moral clarity that exists only in the very young and the very old, that this person needed him more than she did right now. The man on the steps looked at the rabbit. Then he looked at Lily. Something shifted in his face that Rosa could not quite name. "Hi there," he said. His voice was quiet, and Rosa noticed. She noticed things. It was part of how she had survived, that his voice was educated, carefully modulated, not the voice that matched the clothing. "You sad?" Lily asked. She had recently discovered this question and deployed it with the accuracy of a small emotional diagnostician. "A little," the man admitted. And Rosa had the impression that this was perhaps the most honest thing he had said to anyone in quite some time. Lily nodded, accepting this information without judgment. She pushed the rabbit a little closer toward him. Rosa stepped forward. "Lily, sweetheart," the gentleman. "It's okay," the man said quickly, looking up at her. His eyes were gray-green and very direct, and they held something she couldn't read. She's not bothering me. He stopped. Swallowed. She's actually the kindest thing that's happened to me today. Rosa looked at him for a moment. Then she sat down on the steps beside him. Not close, just near enough to keep Lily in arm's reach, and she did not ask why a man in worn clothes was sitting outside an event that cost more than most people made in a decade. She did not ask anything at all. She simply sat and let the quiet be what it was. "I'm Rosa," she said finally. "Alex," he said. Lily climbed up onto the step and settled herself between them without being invited. Mr. Flops now apparently being shared custody, her small warm weight pressing against Rosa's side. Rosa felt the man, Alex, look at Lily with an expression that she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately, and could only ever come up with this. It was the look of someone who had just remembered something essential about what mattered. Above them, through the walls of the Grand Whitmore Hotel, Alexander Mercer's wedding preparations continued without him. They sat together on those cold stone steps for nearly 40 minutes, and Alexander Mercer, who had sat across from presidents and negotiated deals that moved markets, could not remember the last time he had felt so genuinely present in a conversation. Rosa Delgado did not perform. That was the first thing he noticed. She did not arrange herself or her words to create an impression. She spoke the way people speak when they have long since run out of energy for pretense, directly, with quiet warmth, and with the particular authenticity of someone whose life had asked more of them than they had ever expected to give. Lily had appointed herself the conversation's social director, periodically inserting important updates, that Mr. Flops liked the color blue, that she had seen a dog that morning and had been very big and also very friendly, that her favorite food was the noodles Mama makes with the red sauce, and both adults had found themselves responding to her with a seriousness that her commentary deserved. Alexander had asked Rosa, carefully, how long she had worked at the hotel.
"For years," she said.
"Since before Lily." She glanced down at her daughter with a small smile. "The manager here, Mr. Okafor, he's a good man. He let me keep my position when I was pregnant. Didn't have to. A lot of places would have found a reason." She said this without drama, simply as a fact about the world that she had learned to be grateful for rather than angry about. "You're here alone?" he asked. "Raising her alone?" She nodded once. It was not a self-pitying nod. It was a factual one. Her father left when she was 7 months old. It was his loss, honestly. Her eyes went to Lily, who was now very seriously explaining something to Mr. Flops. "She's the best thing in the world. Anyone who can walk away from her doesn't deserve to stay." Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does it get lonely?" Rosa considered this the way she considered everything, genuinely, without rushing to the comfortable answer. "Yes," she said. "But lonely is different from alone. I've got Lily. I've got Mrs. Kaminsky next door who yells at me about my soup being too thin but also cries every time Lily draws her a picture. I've got a life that's mine." She paused. "Lonely visits sometimes. It doesn't live here." He thought about his penthouse, about the 212 booked rooms above his head, full of people celebrating him, most of whom he couldn't trust. Lonely lives there, he thought. I just stopped admitting it. Lily had climbed down from the steps and was now conducting what appeared to be a geological survey of the stone pathway, crouching to examine each crack with scientific intensity. Rosa watched her with that steady, warm vigilance. Never anxious, never hovering, just present. Available. There if needed. "She walked straight up to me," Alexander said. "She didn't know me at all." "She never does that," Rosa said, and there was something wondering in her voice. She usually warms up to people slowly. She'll hide behind my leg for 20 minutes before she even looks at a stranger." She shook her head slightly. "But she took one look at you, and just decided I needed company." Decided you needed company, Rosa agreed softly. Alexander looked at Lily, who had now found something extraordinary in a crack between two stones and was reporting her findings to Mr. Flops in an urgent whisper. His chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with his heart being broken and everything to do with it being reminded of what it was for. He thought about Victoria on these same steps 20 minutes ago. The Louboutins, the dismissal, the way her eyes had moved past him without friction, the way the invisible man on the steps had registered as nothing more than an inconvenience, a shape to step around. He thought about Rosa, who had sat down beside a stranger on the steps of her workplace without being asked, without agenda, without anything to gain from the kindness, who had offered quiet company to someone who looked like he needed it and had not once treated him like a problem to be managed. He thought about what it meant that a woman who had every reason to be hard, who had been left alone with a baby, who cleaned other people's celebrations for a living, who had learned invisibility from the outside, had somehow remained this soft. This genuinely, fiercely soft. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said, with a slight smile that said she reserved the right to answer or not. "What made you sit down?" Most people would have just grabbed their kid and left. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Lily had abandoned her geological survey and was now attempting to teach Mr. Flops to stand independently against the wall, an engineering project that was not going well. "My grandmother used to say that the loneliest people are the ones sitting in plain sight," Rosa said finally. "That the person everyone steps around is the one most in need of someone stopping." She shrugged, a small, unself-conscious movement. "I've been stepped around. I know how it feels. I didn't want you to feel that way." Alexander Mercer, who had been worth over $6 billion since his late 20s and had never once in his professional life been at a loss for words, found he had absolutely nothing to say to that. So he said nothing. And somehow that felt like the right response. 3 floors above them, he knew, the wedding preparations were reaching their final stages. In 2 hours, he would need to make a decision that would reshape the next chapter of his life. The grand ballroom, the 200 guests, the imported gardenias, all of it was waiting for him to walk back through the front doors and become Alexander Mercer, billionaire, groom, husband. But for just this moment, sitting on cold stone steps in borrowed clothes while a 3-year-old attempted to teach her rabbit architectural principles, he was simply Alex. And Alex felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like someone who knew exactly what he valued. Lily suddenly abandoned her project, trotted back to the steps, and climbed up to sit in his lap without asking permission, with the absolute confidence of someone who had assessed the situation and determined this was acceptable. She looked up at him. "Better now?" she asked. His throat was very tight. "Yeah," he said. "Much better." She nodded, satisfied, and leaned back against his chest and looked out at the pathway as though they had known each other for years. Rosa watched this with an expression Alexander couldn't read, something careful and warm and just slightly undone around the edges, and she looked away quickly, as if the moment was too private to witness directly. He made a decision there on those steps. A clear, uncomplicated, bone-certain decision. He stood up slowly, careful not to disturb Lily, who had apparently decided the lap situation was permanent. He gently settled her on the step beside her mother. "I have to go do something," he said. He looked at Rosa directly. "Will you be here? In a few hours? Will you be here?" She looked at him with those warm, careful eyes, and he could see her trying to make sense of him. This man in worn clothing outside a billionaire's wedding, with a question in his voice that sounded more like a door opening than a goodbye. "I work until 6, she said simply. He nodded once. "I'll find you," he said. And then he walked back toward the service entrance, and this time, as he pushed through the door, he stood up straight. At precisely 3:45 in the afternoon, as 200 guests settled into silk-draped chairs in the Grand Whitmore's ballroom, and a string quartet played something that had cost $8,000 to arrange, Alexander Mercer stood in a private anteroom just off the main corridor and straightened the collar of a suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have always expected to wear them. His best man, Daniel Cho, his oldest friend, one of the 3 people on Earth who actually knew him, stood nearby with a glass of scotch he was very clearly waiting to hand over at the first appropriate moment. "You're quiet," Daniel said. "I'm always quiet. You're specifically quiet." Daniel studied him. "Did something happen this morning?" Alexander looked at himself in the mirror. He looked like a groom. He looked like the photograph that would appear in a magazine's society pages in 3 weeks, with a caption about love and legacy and the joining of 2 distinguished families. He looked exactly like the thing he had built the performance of being. "I need you to do something for me," he said. Daniel put down the scotch. 20 minutes later, Alexander walked into the ballroom not from the groom's entrance at the front, but through the main doors at the back, quietly, without announcement, and stood for a moment in the back of the room before anyone realized he was there. He wanted to see it from this angle, this version of the room from the outside, as an observer. Victoria stood at the front, turned slightly in conversation with her maid of honor. She was, objectively, breathtaking, her gown an architectural achievement in ivory silk, her hair swept up in a style that had taken 3 professionals 4 hours to create. She laughed at something her maid of honor said, and the laugh was perfect. Everything about her was perfect, and he felt nothing that resembled the particular, helpless, terrifying tenderness he had felt 3 hours ago, sitting on stone steps, watching a 3-year-old try to teach her rabbit to stand up on its own. He walked forward through the crowd. Guests turned. There was a ripple of surprise at his entrance from the wrong direction, the gentle murmur of a room recalibrating its expectations. He walked past the rows of chairs, past the white roses and the imported gardenias, past the faces of 200 people who had traveled from around the world to watch him make a promise. He walked until he reached Victoria. She had turned fully now, her expression cycling rapidly through surprise, delight, and then, when she read something in his face, a careful, watchful stillness. "Alex," she said, "you're not supposed to. The planner said you'd come from the..." "Victoria." His voice was very quiet. "I need to speak with you. Privately. Right now." She read his face again. Her own went very still. They stepped into the same anteroom he had left 20 minutes ago. The string quartet continued to play. He closed the door. He did not draw it out. He had never been someone who drew things out when the truth was clear. "I heard her phone call," he said. 3 nights ago. In the sitting room." He watched the color change in her face. The first response was denial. He could see her assembling it, the careful architecture of an alternative explanation. He shook his head very slightly, and she stopped. "Alex." "I'm not angry," he said, and this was true in a way that surprised him. "I was. But this morning he stopped. Thought about how to explain a morning on stone steps in borrowed clothes, a woman who sat down beside a stranger without being asked, a 3-year-old who offered the most precious thing she owned to a person she had just met. "I understand what we were to each other," he said, "and I don't think either of us should spend our lives in that." She was quiet for a long time. He had expected tears, manufactured or genuine, or anger, or pleading. What he had not expected was the small, surrendered exhale that she gave instead, and the way her shoulders dropped, the performance releasing. "I did care for you," she said quietly. "In my own way. I want you to know that. I believe you, he said. But I think you and I both deserve something that isn't this. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope that his assistant had prepared that morning, because Alexander Mercer had learned at 27 that when difficult things need doing, you prepare for them in advance. It contained a letter for the guests, a statement of mutual agreement, all the administrative architecture of an uncoupling handled with as much dignity as it could be handled with. He called the wedding planner in, and then the hotel manager, and then he walked back out through the anteroom into the corridor, and he breathed. Daniel was waiting in the hallway. He looked at Alexander's face and said nothing. Then he said, "The Scotch offer still stands." Later, Alexander said, "I have to find someone first." He took off his jacket as he walked, loosening his tie, moving through the service corridors of the Grand Whitmore Hotel with the focused purpose of a man who has realized, late but not too late, exactly where he should be going. He found the housekeeping supervisor, Mrs. Anand, who knew everyone and everything that happened in the building's invisible infrastructure. He described Rosa, warm eyes, gray uniform, the little girl with the dark curls, and watched Mrs. Anand's expression go through 3 separate varieties of confusion before she pointed him toward the East Wing linen room on the 4th floor. The sound reached him before he turned the final corner. Lily's voice, high and bright and completely unself-conscious, singing something that might have been a song or might have been improvised. It was genuinely difficult to tell, while Rosa, he suspected, was finishing the last of her afternoon rounds. He turned the corner and stopped. Rosa was folding linens at the housekeeping cart, and Lily was sitting on an empty laundry bag on the floor, conducting an orchestra that existed only for her. Mr. Flops positioned as first violin. Rosa looked up. She took in the suit, significantly more visible now as a suit than his morning clothing had been as borrowed rags. She took in the loosened tie and the jacket over his arm. She took in his face. Something shifted in her expression that he hoped meant she was doing the math. "Alex," she said carefully. "I told you I'd find you," he said. He told her everything. Not immediately. Not there in the 4th floor corridor with Lily conducting her invisible orchestra, but sitting in the hotel's staff break room, the 3 of them, with terrible vending machine coffee for him and Rosa, and a juice box that had appeared from Rosa's bag for Lily, who is now engaged in the very serious business of making Mr. Flops drink from the straw. He told her about the overheard conversation, about the plan that had formed in the cold, methodical way that difficult decisions sometimes did, about borrowing the clothing and leaving through the service exit before dawn, about sitting on the steps and watching Victoria step past him like weather, like furniture, like nothing. And then he told her about Lily toddling across the pathway with her rabbit held out in both hands, and the way something had broken open in his chest that he hadn't known was locked. Rosa listened the way she seemed to do everything, completely, without performing the act of listening. She held the terrible coffee in both hands, and she looked at him, and she let him talk. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So you're Alexander Mercer," she said slowly. Yes. She processed this. "Your wedding was downstairs today." "Was," he confirmed. "Not anymore." She looked down at her coffee. "And you came to find me because this morning was the most honest 2 hours I've had in longer than I can remember," he said. "Because your daughter walked up to a stranger on the steps and offered him the thing she loved most because she decided he needed it. And I have been in rooms full of people my entire adult life who would never do that, who could not conceive of doing that. And you sat down beside me without knowing anything about me, except that I looked like someone who needed company. And you talked to me like I was a person." He paused. "I'm aware of how this sounds," he said. "I'm aware that I'm sitting here in a $10,000 suit telling a woman I met 4 hours ago that she changed something in me, and that is a sentence that sounds unhinged," Rosa supplied, but there was something careful and warm at the edges of her voice that told him she was not dismissing it. Unhinged, he agreed. But true. Lily had finished administering juice to Mr. Flops and had now relocated herself to sit beside Alexander on the bench, with the proprietorial ease of someone who had decided this was her spot. She leaned against his arm and yawned. Rosa watched her daughter with that expression, that particular expression he had been cataloging all morning, the one that contained more love than most people expressed in a lifetime, and she set down her coffee. "I need to say something to you," she said carefully. "Okay. I'm a hotel housekeeper. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens with my daughter and my neighbor's cat, who comes through the window sometimes, without being invited. I drive a 2014 Honda that needs new rear brakes, and I have $740 in savings, and I'm taking 2 online courses at night toward a hospitality management certificate." She looked at him directly. "I am not a project. I'm not a lesson that the universe arranged for you to learn on your wedding day. I'm a person." "I know," he said. "I need to know that you know that," she said. "Because what you're describing, a man who's just canceled his own wedding, who met me for 40 minutes this morning, that's a lot of intensity to point in someone's direction, and I have a daughter, and I don't have the luxury of." "Rosa." His voice was quiet and very direct. "I know you're a person. That is specifically and precisely why I'm here. Not because you're a lesson. Because you're the most genuinely human person I have met in years, and I think," he stopped, "I think I would like to know you better." Slowly. Correctly. On whatever terms make sense for you and for Lily. He looked down at Lily, who had fallen into the easy, boneless sleep of the very young against his arm. Mr. Flops clutched to her chest. "I'm not asking for anything except the chance to not have this morning be the last time I see you." Rosa looked at her sleeping daughter. She looked at this man in his wedding suit in the staff break room, with the terrible coffee and the truth and the specific, careful way he had said slowly, correctly, which had landed in her chest like something she had not known she was waiting to hear. She thought about being 7 months pregnant and reading the text message on her phone and sitting down on the kitchen floor. She thought about learning invisibility. She thought about her grandmother's hands and the phrase she had offered to a stranger that morning without quite knowing why. The loneliest people are the ones sitting in plain sight, and the way he had received it, like a key finding a lock. "I don't know anything about your world," she said finally. "My world is significantly less impressive from the inside than it looks," he said. "Your suit costs more than my car." "My car is better than my suit," he said. That's an embarrassing sentence to say out loud, but it's true. A small, reluctant smile moved across her face. Just a flicker. But it was real. The same quality of realness that had been present in everything she'd said and done all morning, and Alexander thought that he would spend a considerable amount of time and effort in the coming months trying to be worthy of that smile. "Slowly," she said. "Slowly," he agreed. "And correctly." "And correctly." She looked at Lily, deeply, peacefully asleep against the arm of a billionaire in a staff break room, Mr. Flops standing guard, and she shook her head slowly, with a slightly undone expression of someone navigating a situation that no previous life experience had prepared them for. "She's never done that," Rosa said softly. "Gone to sleep on a stranger. She never does that." "She's not much for pretense," Alexander said. "No," Rosa agreed. "She really isn't." They sat in the quiet of the break room, with the sleeping child between them and the distant sound of an event unwinding several floors below, and neither of them said anything for a while. But it was the particular quality of silence that exists only between two people who are beginning, slowly and correctly, to trust each other. Outside the window, March light was thinning into early evening. The city continued its magnificent indifference. and in a hotel staff break room that had never once been included in any travel magazine's write-up of the Grand Whitmore's amenities, something small and true and unhurried was quietly beginning. 14 months later, on a Saturday morning in May, Alexander Mercer stood in the kitchen of a brownstone in Brooklyn that he had bought not as a grand romantic gesture, but as a practical response to the fact that Queens traffic was genuinely terrible and Lily's new preschool was 3 blocks away, and he was attempting to make the noodles with the red sauce. He had the recipe from Rosa's grandmother's handwritten card, the original, which Rosa had produced from a keepsake box with the solemn ceremony of someone handing over a sacred text, and he had made this particular dish 9 times now, and according to Lily's rigorous quality assessment system, which consisted entirely of the phrase good or not as good as Mama's, he had achieved good status on 6 of those occasions and was very nearly approaching almost like Mama's on the most recent attempt. This was, in Alexander's estimation, a genuine and meaningful professional achievement, ranking somewhere around his 3rd significant acquisition in terms of personal satisfaction. Lily was at the kitchen table behind him, occupied with a drawing that she had been working on with great intensity for the past 20 minutes. She was 4 now, 4.5. She would correct you fiercely, and her capacity for creative work had expanded considerably since the Mr. Flops orchestra days, though Mr. Flops remained a fixture of daily life and had recently been given a formal middle name, Mr. Gerald Flops, after a naming ceremony that Lily had conducted with all the solemnity of a legal proceeding. Rosa came downstairs in the particular unhurried way she moved on Saturday mornings, when the terrible early morning hotel alarm did not apply and the day opened itself gently. She was wearing a gray sweater and her hair was down, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene. The man at her stove, the daughter at the table, the smell of garlic and tomatoes, with an expression that Alexander had spent 14 months learning to read and still sometimes lost his breath over. It was the look of someone who had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. It had taken time to earn that look.
He wanted to be honest about that.
The first months had been genuinely, carefully slow. Coffee in public places, afternoon walks where Lily evaluated local dogs on a scoring system only she understood, dinners where Alexander had learned that earning a child's trust was a more complex and more important project than any deal he had ever negotiated. There had been a week, around month 3, where Rosa had gone quiet in a way that he'd recognized as fear. This is too much. This is too fast. This cannot be real. And he had simply given her space and waited, and sent a single text that said, "No pressure. I'm not going anywhere. Tell me when you're ready." And he had meant it, and she had known he meant it, and that had mattered more than any grand gesture could have. He had met Mrs. Kaminsky, who had told him in the first 10 minutes that she was reserving judgment, and in the first 30 minutes that he made better coffee than Rosa's ex had, and that this was the most meaningful endorsement she had available to offer. He had taken the online hospitality management course materials from Rosa's laptop one evening and read through all of them, not to help her or interfere, but because he wanted to understand what she was working toward and why it mattered to her. And the following week, he had listened for 2 hours while she talked about the program and had asked questions that told her he had actually been paying attention and had watched something shift in her eyes. He had been present. He had shown up. He had done the ordinary, unspectacular, absolutely essential work of being someone she could rely on. There had been a morning, around month 7, when Lily had woken from a nightmare at 2 in the morning and Alexander, who had been sleeping in the guest room with every appropriate boundary firmly in place, had heard her crying through the wall and had sat in the hallway outside her door and said, very softly, "It's okay, Bug. I'm here." And Lily had said from inside the room, "Alex." And he had said, "Yeah." And she had said, "Okay," and gone back to sleep. And Rosa, who had heard all of this from her own room, had come out into the hallway and found him sitting on the floor against the wall, and she had sat down next to him, and he had put his arm around her, and she had let him, and neither of them had said a single word. That had been the night he had understood, with certainty, that what was happening was real. Not the feeling, he had been certain of the feeling for much longer than that, but the realness of it. The weight and the permanence, and the sense that this was not something that had been arranged by circumstance, but something that had been built deliberately by two people who had both decided it was worth building. He had proposed 3 months ago, not in any restaurant that anyone would write about, not with a gesture that would be described in society pages. They had been at Prospect Park, the three of them, on a Sunday afternoon in early February when the light was thin and cold and beautiful, and Lily was conducting her latest scientific inquiry into whether squirrels could be trusted, and he had simply turned to Rosa and said, "I would like to do this for the rest of my life. The squirrels, and the Sunday, and you. Specifically and particularly you. Will you marry me?" He had the ring in his coat pocket. Rosa had looked at him for a long moment with those warm, careful, completely real eyes, and then Lily had turned around from the squirrel situation and said, "Are you guys going to kiss?" with significant impatience, and Rosa had laughed, the big, unself-conscious laugh that he had decided very early on was his favorite sound in the world, and said yes to both the question and the question behind the question. Now, in the Brooklyn kitchen on the May morning, Rosa crossed to the stove and looked over his shoulder at the sauce and said, "More basil," with the authority of someone who has been watching a person make a good-faith effort to learn something important, and he added more basil, and Lily looked up from her drawing. "It's done," Lily announced. "Can I see?" Rosa asked, crossing to the table. Lily held up the drawing. It was, in the generous interpretive tradition that all parents of 4-year-olds must develop, a picture of 3 people standing together. The 2 larger figures had a clear size differential, but were recognizable as adults, side by side. Between them stood a small figure with what appeared to be circular hair. And next to the small figure, rendered in brown crayon with enormous care, was a shape that could only be Mr. Gerald Flops. "That's us," Lily confirmed, with the satisfaction of an artist presenting work she is genuinely proud of. "It's beautiful, baby," Rosa said softly. "The tall one is Alex," Lily explained to both of them, as though this required clarification. "He's tall in real life also." Alexander turned from the stove. He looked at the drawing. He looked at Lily, who was watching him with those serious dark eyes, the eyes that had found him on a cold stone steps over a year ago and had seen, with absolute clarity, that he was sad and that something should be done about it. He thought about the morning he had walked out of the Grand Whitmore Hotel dressed in borrowed clothes to discover something true about the woman he thought he loved. He had discovered something true, only it was not about Victoria. It was about what he had been missing, about what real, unhurried, unperformed kindness looked like, about what it felt like to be seen by someone who had nothing to gain from seeing you. He crossed to the table and crouched down to Lily's level. "It's perfect," he told her seriously. She looked at him with the evaluating expression of someone checking work quality. Then she nodded and held out the drawing. "You can have it," she said. "So, you don't get sad anymore." His throat was very tight. Rosa made a small sound behind him that she covered quickly. "Thank you," he said. And then, because it was true and she was 4.5 and deserved to hear true things, "You're the bravest person I know, Lily." She considered this. "Braver than Mama?" "You're both very brave in different ways." She weighed this response for fairness. "Okay," she decided. "That's good." He stood up holding the drawing. Rosa was looking at him with the expression that had taken 14 months of slow, correct, patient work to earn, and he thought about everything it had taken to get to this kitchen, this morning, this light. He thought about stone steps and cold coffee, and a stuffed rabbit offer with both hands by someone who had everything to hold on to and chose to give it away anyway. He thought about what it meant that the truest thing that had ever happened to him had begun with a 3-year-old who had simply refused to walk past a sad person without stopping. Rosa came to stand beside him, her shoulder warm against his arm, both of them looking at Lily, who had already moved on to her next project with the efficiency of someone who has delivered what she came to deliver and has other important business to attend to. "Noodles are ready," Alexander said.
"I know," Rosa said.
"I could smell the basil from upstairs." More basil was the right call. It was always the right call. You just needed to trust it. He looked at her. She was not talking about the sauce, and they both knew it. "Yeah," he said. "I did." Outside, May was doing what May does in Brooklyn, pouring itself generously through kitchen windows and over fire escapes and into the particular weekend quiet of a neighborhood going gently about its Saturday. Inside, a small family that had found each other sideways, through borrowed clothing and stone steps and the absolute moral courage of a 3-year-old with a stuffed rabbit, sat down together for the noodles with the red sauce. And it was, Lily confirmed after the first bite, with the gravity of someone whose opinion on this matter was final and unimpeachable, almost like Mama's, which, everyone at the table agreed, was exactly enough.